All right, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the fascinating, incredibly complex web of systemic failures that brought down one of history's wealthiest superpowers, the Mughal Empire. We so often hear this really simple story of conquest and defeat, But when we actually dig into the historical sources, something much wilder is revealed. We're looking at an empire that essentially engineered its own demise, right from the inside out. So, the core question we really have to ask here is, how does a seemingly invincible superpower completely unravel? You don't just go from possessing unimaginable wealth and absolute military might to total collapse overnight. That's just not how it works. It requires a very specific sequence of disastrous decisions, massive structural flaws, and honestly, just sheer bad luck. As we go through the evidence, we're going to trace the exact fault lines that fractured the Mughal state long before any foreign powers showed up to deal the final blow. Now, it's super tempting to just pin the whole collapse on one guy's policies. Historians like Jadanav Sarkar have often pointed the finger squarely at Emperor Aurangzeb's religious bigotry. But when you look at the sources, they reveal a much deeper structural rot. While Aurangzeb's policies absolutely alienated key allies, pinning the fall of an entire superpower on one man's intolerance completely ignores the massive economic and administrative avalanches that were already tumbling down the mountain. And that brings us to the actual root of the problem. Shah Jahan inherited immense wealth, sure, but he spent it like a billionaire without a budget. He literally poured staggering amounts of money into monumental architecture, like the Taj Mahal, of course, and aggressive southward expansion in the Deccan. When you cross-reference his massive expenditures against the empire's rapidly depleting revenues, you see the foundation of a catastrophic fiscal crisis. He was basically bleeding the state's coffers dry, prioritizing prestige and expansion way above long-term financial stability. So the crucial takeaway here is that by the time Aurangzeb takes the throne, he is not starting from scratch. Actually, scratch that. He was starting from way less than scratch. He was stepping right into a massive economic disaster. He inherited an empty treasury and a state apparatus that was already severely strained financially. His subsequent actions weren't just made in a vacuum. They were the desperate reactions of a ruler trying to plug holes in a rapidly sinking ship. To fix this inherited fiscal mess, Aurangzeb desperately tried two big solutions. First, increase the khalisa, which is the direct crown land, to boost immediate state revenue. Second, increase the tax burden on the peasantry. Now, on paper, this looks like basic math to fix a deficit, right? But in reality, it was an absolute recipe for structural suicide. To really grasp why this was such a total disaster, we have to talk about the Jagirdari system. This was the absolute administrative backbone of the entire empire. Instead of paying officers or mansabdars with cold hard cash, the Mughal state granted them jagirs. This was essentially the right to collect land revenue from a specific area to maintain their troops and their lavish lifestyles. The whole administration functioned on the promise that there was enough productive land to go around to pay everybody. And here is where the dominoes just start crashing down. Aurangzeb's choice to hoard crown land meant his own officers suddenly couldn't get paid. By increasing the khalisa, he drastically shrank the pool of available jagirs. Suddenly, you have way more officers than available land. Think of it like a modern corporation suddenly running out of stock options to pay its top executives. The basic minimum requirement for the system to work was totally broken, and officers turned against each other, fiercely fighting for whatever revenue-generating land was left. Historian Satish Chandra famously called this the Jagirdari crisis. It's when the desperate bureaucracy basically began corrupting and eating itself from the inside just to survive. Because these officers knew their land grants weren't permanent and were highly contested, they completely stopped caring about long-term administration. Instead, they focused entirely on overexploiting the land and the people, extracting as much wealth as quickly as humanly possible before the land was reassigned to someone else. Bureaucratic self-destruction was in full swing. While all that internal rot is happening, Aurangzeb's second solution, hiking up taxes, ran headfirst into a totally unexpected enemy, the climate. Modern historical research shows that exactly when Aurangzeb demanded more taxes, the subcontinent was hit by severe El Niño climate anomalies. Rainfall plummeted, crops failed, and the peasants were squeezed tighter than ever. This explosive combination directly sparked violent uprisings from peasant groups like the Jats and the Satnamis. Just imagine the absolute misery here. You're a peasant, facing failing monsoons and higher state taxes at the exact same time. This leads directly to what historians term the agrarian crisis, resulting in open rebellion. The peasants essentially realized they had absolutely nothing left to lose. The state taxation system completely collapsed because the peasants simply refused to pay, turning an already bad economic situation into an irreversible tailspin. If you picture this whole mess as a pyramid of crisis, the base is that initial fiscal collapse, which birthed the administrative decay in the middle, ultimately topping out with mass agrarian revolts. The overspending created the fiscal crisis. The reaction to the fiscal crisis created the Jagirdari crisis, and the compounding environmental and tax pressures created the agrarian crisis. Each layer fundamentally weakened the structure, practically guaranteeing a collapse. Then you just pile on top of this rotting structural pyramid Aurangzeb's alienation of his critical Rajput allies, the relentless attacks from Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj and the Marathas, and later, devastating foreign invasions from Nadir Shah and Ahmad Shah of Delhi. The core was rotting, the administration was rebelling, the peasants were revolting, and external enemies were relentlessly hammering at the gates. It was a completely unsolvable, perfect storm. After Aurangzeb died in 1707, things went from bad to worse. A string of weak successors rapidly accelerated the decline instead of arresting it. We're talking from Bahadur Shah I all the way to Muhammad Shah Rangila, whose nickname literally translates to the Merry One because he was known mostly for partying while the empire quite literally burned around him. The central authority just vanished. These successors were often mere puppets to powerful nobles, completely unable to reverse the cascading institutional failures. But perhaps the most devastating blow, the real nail in the coffin, came during the reign of Farrukh Shir. His desperate economic concessions fundamentally shifted power in the subcontinent forever. Operating from a position of severe weakness and desperate for literally any revenue or support he could find, he issued a royal decree, or farman, in 1717, and this decree would prove utterly fatal to the region's independence. For basically nothing, Farrukh Shir gave the British East India Company duty-free trade and minting rights. Think about this. For just 3,000 rupees, the British got to trade duty-free in Bengal. For 10,000 rupees, they got the exact same privilege in Surat. Worse still, they were allowed to mint coins in Bombay that were legally equivalent to Mughal currency. He essentially sold the economic sovereignty of the empire for pennies, hollowing it out just to appease an external corporate entity. All of this internal decay hollowed out the core, creating a massive power vacuum. This gave rise to independent regional states and paved the exact path for eventual European conquest. Successor states like Bengal, Awadh, and Hyderabad broke away, acting totally independently while still nominally, acknowledging the emperor. The British East India Company simply watched, waited, and systematically played these newly fractured warring regional kingdoms against one another to aggressively expand their own control. So I'm going to leave you with this provocative thought to chew on. Considering the Mughals' cascading structural failures, do superpowers ever really lose to outside forces, or do they just inevitably collapse under their own internal weight? The British didn't conquer a unified, functioning superpower. No way. They walked into a house whose foundation had already been entirely eaten away by fiscal recklessness, administrative self-destruction, and environmental crisis. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I hope this deep dive totally changes how you look at the fall of historical giants.